The second objection that David Bose considers essentially states that drug users often directly cause harm and violence to others, that drug users often directly violate the rights of others in the process of using the drug. You might think of this second objection as different than the first objection because the first objection seemed to be saying that drug users indirectly cause harm and violence, whereas this one is saying that drug users can directly cause harm and violence. And therefore, these dangerous drugs should be prohibited to prevent this violence in society. There's already enough violence in society. There's already enough violation of people's rights in society. Let's prohibit drugs to prevent further violation of rights. This is the second objection. In response, David Bose essentially argues that we ought to treat these drugs like cocaine, heroin, meth, and marijuana the same as we treat alcohol and cigarettes and nicotine and tobacco and prescription drugs. That is to say, of course, if you drive under the influence of cocaine and you cause a car accident, you are clearly violating the rights and freedoms of others. You are clearly harming another member of society, which you ought not be allowed to do. However, that's what happens every day with alcohol and driving under the influence of alcohol. There are over 10,000 deaths a year related to alcohol-impaired driving. And yet, alcohol continues to be legal, and no one is arguing that alcohol ought to be prohibited, right? Instead, most would argue that people ought to be given the freedom to use alcohol, right? They ought to be given individual responsibility to use alcohol, to drink alcohol. And if they cause harm to others in the process, if they violate the rights of others in the process by getting into a fight or driving under the influence, then they should be held accountable and they should be punished, right? But you do not prohibit the freedom in the first place. Bose wants to say we should treat these other drugs in the exact same way. Let's grant people the freedom to use cocaine, marijuana, or heroin. And most people, just like in the case of alcohol, will use these drugs responsibly if we give them the opportunity. And if that person does, in fact, end up causing harm to another person, or posing a risk of harm to another person, then they will be punished and held responsible. But we should not prohibit the freedom in the first place. That is an undue, unnecessary, and unjustified limitation on people's liberties and freedoms. So to be rationally and logically consistent, we should treat all drugs the same, and all drugs should be legalized, and people should be punished for using those drugs in irresponsible ways.